Do you feel the need? The need for leads? The reality for most of us as business owners is that we rely on consistent sales for both business growth and ongoing viability. Those sales don't come from simply throwing content and offers at strangers on the internet. Instead, we need a steady flow of motivated, qualified leads. Inside the Takeoff program, we are currently preparing for Leads at Speed. This is a 2-week event to flood your inbox with those high-intent, hot leads. But if you'd like to join us, the doors to the Takeoff program are closing on the 7th of March. So make sure that you head to tashcorbin.com/takeoff and check it all out today. And if you'd like to join us for Leads at Speed, make sure that you enroll before the 7th of March. That link again is tashcorbin.com/takeoff. Hello, it's day 2 of Tashmas. So if you missed it yesterday, we've got daily podcast episodes dropping from the 1st to the 12th of March in the countdown to my birthday, which is on the 12th of March. So yesterday for day 1 of Tashmas, we talked about joint ventures and collaborations. And today I want to talk to you a little bit more about webinars. Now, in every day of Tashmas, I have a podcast episode that dives into a particular strategy or mindset to help you with your business. And there is also a gift or a freebie or a prize that you can win. So I've got that for you again today. And I just quickly want to say that I did do a podcast recently about maximizing attendance at webinars, and hooey, did some people have some feelings about that episode. It was amazing. I loved all of your comments. I loved all of your emails. So thank you so much. And in that episode, I invited people to ask me further questions about webinars, but also about any other strategy. So it was a great episode. I'm not going to lie. I was pretty impressed with myself. And we got a little sassy towards the end of it. And I think that's what really resonated with people maybe. But anyway, I just wanted to quickly say I will link back to that episode if you missed it because it was a juicy one. But it's clear to me that people are interested in hearing a little more about this slightly different approach to running webinars. Like for some people, I feel like it's a bit of a revelation when they hear me talk about webinars through the lens of like showing up in teacher mode and making it valuable whether people buy from you or not. And this is an opportunity to establish a relationship with people in your audience. And like all they've ever heard about webinars before is like sell, hustle, trick people, force people, make people do things, bribe people. And it's all about what you can get out of running a webinar rather than what you're giving when you run a webinar as well. And so I loved that response, and I loved that there's clearly like been a big influx of new people into my audience, I'm going to say, who maybe haven't been to my webinars before. And so do keep an eye out for those. I've got a few coming up. But I love this conversation, and I love that we're coming at it a little fresher. And, you know, sometimes I think, oh, I've said all that I can say about webinars on this podcast, or I've said all I can say about webinars on my Facebook and all that kind of stuff. But it's a beautiful reminder that we consistently have new people coming into our audience, or maybe people haven't, you know, listened to all of my podcast episodes before. You know, I need to remind myself the world doesn't revolve around me, and you don't eat up every single word that I say. Well, not all of you. I see some of you. But anyway, and so what I thought for this episode is that I'm actually going to go through like what are my webinar strategies and the things that I do in webinars that kind of buck the normal trend. So where do I diverge from what you may have seen as advice or strategies to ensure that you run great webinars and that your webinars do a good job. So that is what we're going to talk about in this episode. I'm going to share with you my strategies for webinars that buck the usual trends. And yes, this is day 2 of Tashmas. It's also episode number 463 of the podcast, which means you can find all the relevant links and the show notes for today's episode, along with the instructions to get today's present, over at tashcorbin.com/463. So let's dive in. We're talking webinars again. Hello, I'm Tash Corbin, a business strategist and mentor based on the Sunshine Coast in Australia. The mission of this podcast is to help heart-centered entrepreneurs to make more money, and in doing so, change the world for the better. This podcast was recorded on the lands of the Gubbi Gubbi and Jinnaburra people. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So if you haven't yet picked up by now, I'm not like all those other webinar hosts. I'm a cool webinar host. Little Mean Girls reference there. I do webinars differently to what you may have seen from other people who teach webinar strategy. Number one, that is because I love being in teacher mode, and I love creating my marketing strategy and my sales strategy to be built around things that are in my zone of genius. And I like showing up at my best, not just for people who've paid me, but also for everyone. And webinars are a big part of that. So I've definitely been taught, and I've definitely been through programs, and I've definitely worked with coaches who are trying to convince me to give less value in my webinars, trying to convince me to do more, setting people up to feel a bit anxious towards the end of my webinars, to do more of the hard sell stuff in my webinars. But I'm not interested in that. And so I wanted to talk through actually more of the tangible strategies and the things that I do in webinars that you may not have heard people talk about before, or you may not have seen before or overtly noticed the difference before. So I just kind of wanted to go through 6 key things that I see that I do quite differently to what I have seen as being the norm. So the first one of those is that I don't charge money for webinars. And I understand that there are a lot of different opinions and pieces of advice around charging for webinars. And when I say webinar, I should first be explicit with my definition of a webinar. So when I say webinar, I mean an online web-based seminar. But that can be an online workshop, a masterclass, right? I don't care what kind of label that you give it. But when I say webinar, I mean you show up for 30 minutes to 2 hours, you teach something, there's an upsell at the end. And in most cases, people opt in for that webinar with their email address, right? So I'm not talking about doing a Facebook Live where no one opts in. I'm not talking about, a half day, big paid event, blah, 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 right? I'm talking about a web-based seminar, and whether that has like workshop style activities involved, whether it's, you would describe it as a masterclass or whether you would describe it as an online training. I don't mind what you call it. I'm just going to call it a webinar for all of these sorts of things. But I do understand that it has been taught very consistently, at least for the last 7 years, that you should charge people for webinars. And my take on that is a little different. And particularly in my own business strategy, I don't charge for webinars because one of my big goals with the webinars that I run is list growth, is growing my mailing list. And if I charge for webinars, 95% of the people who sign up are already on my mailing list. And if I don't charge for webinars, it's more like 50-50. 50% of people are from my mailing list and 50% of people are colder audience. It's their first kind of time on my mailing list. And so because I have that goal of getting people on my mailing list as part of the measures of success of my webinar, I don't charge for them. And I have definitely heard all the reasons and the case studies and all of that sort of thing as to why to charge for webinars. And I'm not saying that I would never charge for, that kind of thing. I have charged for them in the past. I've experimented with it in the past. But where my goal is list growth as well as promoting an offer, I don't charge for webinars because the list growth part of the webinar outcomes is significantly reduced if I charge for a webinar. Now, one of the core reasons why I have seen quoted as why you should charge for webinars is that people are more likely to value it, they're more likely to turn up, and they're more likely to buy the next thing from you. And I totally understand, and I can definitely see that there's data to support that. But would I rather convert 20% of people who've paid for a webinar and there are 10 people in the room, or convert 3% of people who have got a webinar for free and there are 600 people in the room? If I have a goal of growing my mailing list, I would rather have 600 people in the room. If I have a goal of selling only to my hottest audience, then that may be a time where I would charge for a webinar. And so there's a big difference between those two things, right? So actually this has taken shape in the way that I launch the Takeoff program these days. In the past, I used to run free webinars, and I also ran free 5-day events. And those 5-day events I found worked better for my warmer audience than they did for a cold audience. And those 5-day events needed to have a little bit more mentorship and engagement, and they were more like getting closer to the conversion kind of part of the client attraction process. And so I started charging for the client attraction challenge and the other 5-day events that I run as lead magnets in my business. So a lot of people see that and assume that they should charge for webinars because Tash charges for 5-day client attraction challenge. And I just wanted to unpack that. Because actually, no, I have 2 parts to my Takeoff launches. If I do a launch where I run the challenge, I will focus the challenge on converting warmest audience. And I also will do 1 or 2 free webinars where I'm drawing in colder audience and also nurturing and potentially converting some people from warmer audience as well. So if I am doing a webinar to attract and nurture cold audience, as well as the other jobs that my webinar does, I don't charge for my webinar. And I also find that a lot of the advice about charging for a webinar comes from kind of fuzzy data, in that we were always told in marketing, I did marketing at university in the year 2000, right? So we were even told then, in marketing, it is a long-held belief that it is easier to sell to an existing customer than to sell to someone who's never bought from you before, right? So yes, that is true. And that is true in most cases. If you are looking for short-term income, one of the best places to focus your attention is your past and existing clients. 100% agree with that advice. But that data and that rhetoric has kind of been manipulated and applied in spaces where it doesn't quite ring true in other spaces, in the online marketing space in particular. And particularly if your niche or your focus of your audience is women and or marginalized people, it has been shown in some circumstances that if you charge for a low ticket product, whether that be a live event like a webinar or a low ticket template pack or an event or something like that, a low ticket course, for women and marginalized people in particular, there can be a reduction in conversion in the subsequent 60 to 90 days because marginalized people tend to stop themselves from buying the next thing until they've finished the first thing. So if I pay for a webinar and I haven't watched the webinar and I haven't implemented the advice and done my homework from the webinar, I won't allow myself to buy the next offer until I've got the value from the first thing. Now, the psychological reason for that, particularly being prevalent in marginalized people, is that marginalized people have historically had access to less resources, therefore have to be more careful with the resources they have access to, therefore have often self-imposed rules and restrictions about needing to finish what they've got first before they're allowed another. And that generally and in a lot of cases comes from the fact that that was actually something that was programmed into them as children or in their upbringing, or it's a generational thing. So if you think about like, you don't get dessert until you've cleaned off your plate because food is scarce for us, or you can't buy another book until you finish the book that you started reading, even though it's not a great book. But books, they cost money and we don't get a lot of books until you've got to finish what you started. Or you can't join the netball team, not naming any names, Tash, until you've completed the semester of marching band that you harassed us into signing you up for, and now you're over it, right? So, if you come from a background where resources were limited, then often there is a more tendency to force yourself to finish what you've bought before you allow yourself to grab the next thing. Now, that can even apply to free things, but it's less prominent where the webinar was free. So whilst I understand the whole, yes, it's easier to resell to someone you've already sold to, I totally get it. I see where it came from. I'm very familiar with the history of that in marketing circles. I also think that advice needs to be updated, and there's a lot more nuance to it, particularly online and particularly where you may focus on marketing to marginalized people. So I generally do not charge for webinars, and I generally advise not charging for webinars, which I think bucks the trends. Like right now, the amount of $9 webinars popping up in my newsfeed right now, oh my goodness. I'm like, I know what this is. You would normally give this away for free, but you're charging $9 for it because you want to, in some way, force people's hand in getting them to show up to it and making sure that they make use of it. But then also, you've been told that it will convert better. And so therefore, and it probably will convert better. But do you want to convert a higher percentage of a smaller audience or a lower percentage of a larger audience? A lot of people are running webinars consistently because they want to grow their audience and they want to learn from their audience and they want to understand their audience and they want to connect with their audience, and they're hiding their best work behind a paywall. And I think that can be a mistake. So that's number one. Number two, I don't dictate how people engage with my webinars. That is quite ableist, and it also makes assumptions about people's capacity to pay attention and the way that everyone should engage with learning in my webinars. So, for example, I do not tell everyone at the start of a webinar, give me your undivided focus, turn your phone off, close down all those tabs, because I know that some people learn better with tabs open. I know that some people will close their tabs over their cold body, right? Like there are some people who, when I say I close every tab on my laptop every single day, they gasp and clutch at their pearls because they couldn't imagine a world in which they closed every tab down. They're not gonna anyway, right? I also know for myself, I learn best when I have visual stimulation. So I will often listen to webinars walking, so I like seeing a different view, or I will listen to webinars scrolling through a visual medium like Instagram. It's one of my favorite times to Instagram scroll through feed posts, not necessarily through video, but through feed posts. I love catching up all my close friends' images and updates and holiday photos and all of those sorts of things. I love scrolling through my personal Facebook feed during that time as well as I listen. So I don't dictate how people engage with my webinars. I also don't make them live attendance only and not have a replay. And I talked about that in maximizing webinar attendance and why I don't resort to that to maximize webinar attendance, because I know that for some people it's not the right time, or they learn best when they can stop and start. I've got to be honest with you, I love listening to webinars at double speed. It stops me getting distracted. That's an ADHD thing, right? I love listening to podcasts and webinars super fast, to the extent where sometimes Davey and I will listen to podcasts that he also likes together in the car, and I have to slow it down to regular speed for him because he doesn't like listening to them sped up. And to me, it sounds like they're drunk when they're talking, because I'm so used to them talking super fast at me. And that's how I process information really well, and I stay focused. And so in some cases, I'll come to a webinar live, and after 10 to 15 minutes, I realize I've been distracted 3 or 4 times. So I'll decide, being here live is not good for me. I'll watch the replay instead. The best ones for me to watch live have a really active chat box. If it's a webinar where there's not a lot going along in the chat box, then I will sometimes prefer to watch the replay because the chat box is not really a happening place, and so it's not enough to keep me engaged and not get distracted. But yeah, I don't dictate how people engage with my webinar or with the replay either. So I allow people to have full control over the replay. They can play, pause, rewind, fast forward. It's ableist to dictate how people engage with a webinar. So I'm not going to do that. I want an inclusive approach to webinars, but I also know it's better for my audience, and it actually does a better job of building that relationship and doing all the jobs a webinar can do, not just getting sales. Like, getting sales is one of the jobs of my webinars, but it's not all of the jobs. Now, I also don't have slides with client success stories littered throughout my webinars. And I know this is a strategy that's taught. Now, I'm talking about the things that I do that buck the trends, right? And buck what you would normally see. Often I'll see a webinar structured where it says, so here's what we're going to do in the webinar. And if you do this, you could be like my client X, and they did this, and look at them, they're making $35,000 a month now. And then they go and they give you their first tip or piece of, here's the number one reason why people don't do this thing. And then this person wasn't doing it either. And then da-da-da-da. And so what they're doing is they're using those client stories and testimonials to reinforce that buying from them is a good idea, and show, oh, look, you silly nugget, you silly muffin. You haven't been doing these things, and therefore you don't have the results that my clients have. So there's a layered reason as to why I don't use client success slides littered throughout my webinars. Number one, it extends the feeling of being sold to for the audience, because you really are pitching when you're talking about these client success stories. And it is also a psychological manipulation strategy. The results that you see and the client testimonials that you see are actually very carefully curated. They're curated to present an expectation of where you should be by now, and the resistance and the mistakes that other people made, that when they fixed those, they had those kinds of results. And so what it's trying to do is actually increase your anxiety that you don't have the same results as all of the people. You know, it's making the kinds of results that you're seeing in the testimonials the rule. Like, that's what everyone else is doing. Why are you not doing that? So it's making you feel like the odd one out, that you don't have those results. It's making you feel less than for not having those results there yet. It's increasing your sense of anxiety and urgency about needing to have those kinds of results. But also it's oversimplifying the workload required to get you from where you are to where you want to be, to those results. because in those testimonials, they don't talk about all of the failures in between and the missteps and the hard work and the hustle that went in. They don't talk about the arguments that went back and forward on the calls. And they don't talk about the fact that that person had $50,000 in the bank waiting for them to invest in their business when they first started and all of those sorts of things. They don't talk about the difference between that person and you, because they couldn't possibly do that for every person in the audience. So client testimonials and success stories littered throughout webinars often oversimplify the process from where you are to having the same results as them. And they'll often be used as a way of overcoming your worries about what might be a reason why you might not have the same success as them. So, when you start unpacking this, you'll start to be able to see the matrix a little, and you might start to see this littered throughout the things that you go to. But you'll often see one client testimonial is, oh, I didn't have the time. But thanks to working with this person, I was able to do it in very little time. And then another one will be, oh, I only have a high school education, or I'm a high school dropout and I didn't have the education. And then another person will be like, I didn't have the money. And, I was really skeptical that I could do this without spending lots and lots of money, but I made so much money really quickly and I got my return on investment. And then there'll be another one. It's like, I have a complex life and I have kids and I did it, right? So you're actually being fed a lot of objections. Now, the thing that they don't tell you is that often the person that didn't have a lot of time had money and they had resources and they had a previous experience in a similar situation and they'd done it before. And then they don't tell you the person that didn't have a lot of money, they had a lot of time and they had a partner who was looking after their kids full time and da-da-da-da-da. And then they don't, right? So they don't tell you all of the objections in one go. They share them littered through different individual client testimonials and client success stories. But what it adds up to for your brain is, with no money, no resources, no time, and a complex life, I can still get the results. All of these people are getting this result, so I can too. All of these people magically, were able to run 5K in just 6 weeks, so I will be able to as well. All of these people were able to completely transform their experience of parenting their neurodivergent child, so I will be able to as well, right? People add up the testimonials instead of addressing them individually as listeners. Webinar trainers, webinar presenters know this. And so they do it very specifically. So it creates a sense of urgency and anxiety and almost like a sense of, I'm behind because I don't have the results of all of these other people. But it also addresses some of the common reasons why you think it might not be available to you and oversimplifies the process of getting you from where you are to those results. And so that is why I do not use them. Not only do I not use them, I despise them. I will say it outright. I despise seeing it. I even to the extent where I've gone to speakers at my conferences and said, hey, we got your slides. Can you take out all the client testimonials, please? It just gets real salesy. Can we just keep it to one if we have to have any? Because it just starts to feel webinar-y and it starts to feel like you're trying to dial up people's anxiety about not being there yet. That's really not something that we would see on a conference stage as a paid speaker. So I'm unafraid to say things like that though, because you know me, I call this stuff out. So I despise those client success slides littered throughout. I just don't do it. Now, I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm not saying don't share testimonials. Go for it if you want to share testimonials. But I think a lot of people have been taught how to structure webinars and how to do this without being told the psychology and the actual marketing strategy behind it. And then when you realize what that strategy is, you don't want to make people feel like that. You don't want to increase people's anxiety that they haven't got there yet. You don't want to make people buy from a sense of, oh, I'm the only silly sausage who hasn't done it yet. You don't want that to be their driver for buying. And so I just want you to make an informed choice about how you choose to use testimonials and engage with that kind of stuff. So I don't use those. Number 4, I don't bribe people to watch my webinars. I don't have bonus resources that only people who watch it get. I don't have offers that are only available to webinar people. I don't have offers that expire at the end of the webinar. Like, I definitely see that as a big one. Like, if you're here live, you get a different sales pitch. And if you buy before the end of the webinar, before we close up, then you get this bonus, or you get this discount, or you get this like extra thing. I don't do any of that, because what it does is it often further marginalizes the marginalized people in my audience who didn't get a chance to go live. It adds pressure to the purchase decision, and it stops people from engaging their actual like frontal cortex in the decision-making process. It puts them in panic mode, right? Fight, flight, fear, or freeze, or whatever, right? I've totally messed that up, fawn or freeze. And so I don't want to do that to people. That's not a consent-based marketing practice. So I don't treat people watching the replay differently from people who are there live. And I don't use bribery, i.e. like you'll get a special treat, or you'll get a special freebie, or you'll get a special offer to incentivize people to attend or watch my webinars. I want people to watch my webinars because they're excited for the webinar, because the topic really got to the heart of what they were looking for, because they're excited to implement the strategies they learn on the webinar, because the webinar is relevant to them right now. It's the thing that they've been looking for. And if I don't know how to craft a webinar that speaks to that, then that's on me, and I need to refine and learn how to do that instead of try and circumvent the desire part and just dial it up through fear and anxiety about missing out on some life special offer that'll never be offered again. I don't like doing that to people, and some special resource you can never get any other way. No, I don't do that. So I don't bribe people to watch. That's number 4. Number 5, I don't hold back on the value I put in my webinars. Now, I will say I tend to run webinars that are 90 minutes generally. Sometimes I can get it into a 60-minute webinar. So I am generally very boundaried around the time for my webinars and what I'm presenting, but I jam in as much value as I can, not as much content, but as much value as I can to that webinar, because I am 100% clear on my belief in myself that I have far more to offer than I could give away in a 90-minute webinar. I have seen the abhorrent phrase, I hate this phrase so much, why buy the cow when you get the milk for free? And if you give away too much for free in your webinars, then people will never buy from you. I've definitely seen that shared over and over and over again in advice about webinars. But that is actually fear-based advice. That is, you have so little to give and so little value to share that if you say too much in your webinar, no one will ever want to buy from you. Well, if all the value that you have to share can be jammed into a 90-minute webinar, I don't think you actually have a viable business. Let's be honest. So we need to remember there's a big difference between information and transformation. And we also need to remember that there is far more value to working with you than could possibly be jammed into a free webinar. Now, I want to caveat that with more content doesn't equal more value, right? So if I'm teaching how to grow your mailing list, giving people 78 different strategies and ways they could grow their mailing list isn't more valuable than walking people through 3 detailed strategies appropriate for 3 key phases of business. Very different webinars. So I need to be able to discern for my audience what is going to be most valuable for them. And in most cases, it's giving them 1 to 2 great strategies, maybe 1 intermediate and 1 advanced strategy, but walking them through the ins and outs of that strategy, why I teach that strategy that way, how to implement that strategy, where to do the intermediate version, where to do the advanced version, and actually teaching something people can use. That is far more valuable to my audience than here's 79 options for how you might grow your mailing list. So see the difference there between more content, 79 ways to grow your list, versus more value. Here are the 3 key things that I would recommend you do to grow your mailing list. And here's how to do that when you're first starting out. Here's how to do that as you get to creating more traction. And here's how to do that when you have lots and lots of resources, team support, and financial investment available, right? So I'm walking people through something in much more depth with much more practical advice, therefore far more valuable. Yeah. So I'm not suggesting you talk faster. I'm not suggesting you run a webinar that's 8 hours long because more equals more. No. Let's be mindful that there's a difference between just giving people information and facilitating a transformation. And sometimes the transformation, the most valuable transformation that people can get from coming to your webinar is a giant realization, a giant light bulb moment. Oh, the reason why none of my strategies have worked before is because I'm missing this critical element. I get it now. Right? I also think that there's this big push to always have something practical and tangible and something people can do when they walk away from your webinar, and do as in like, here's a workbook, or here's a template, or here's a checklist, or here's a 16-step strategy. Go and implement it. And that doesn't always equate to the most value. There's a difference between the most content and the most value. There's a difference between the most advice and the most value. There's a difference between the most step-by-step instructions and the most value. They aren't always the same. Sometimes they overlap, but sometimes they don't. So it's your job as the provider, as the expert in your area of genius, and as the student of your niche and understanding where they get themselves stuck, to really refine your capacity to discern what is going to be of most value to your audience. What will they value the most, and what will be most valuable for them? So just because you give people really valuable advice and insights in your webinar does not then mean they're never going to buy from you. There is an art and a structure and a strategy to crafting a webinar in a way that really does maximize value and facilitate that transformation, and also for the right people, bridge them into considering your offer, your upsell at the end, but it's not forcing people through a big sausage factory funnel by barely skipping over the detail and barely giving them anything that they can actually use in order to maximize the number of people who buy from you at the end. That just grinds my gears. So I don't do any of that stuff. Instead, I stand confident in my belief that the work that I do with people when they purchase my program or when they purchase my VIP package or whatever it is that I'm offering is deeply, deeply valuable. And there is no way that I could give it all away for free in a webinar. That is not there's a big difference in the value proposition of what people learn and implement from the webinar versus what I am then offering them. And it's not as easy as summing it up as, the webinar is like listening to the CD and then the course is like being at the concert. What does that mean if you're a parenting coach? That is meaningless, right? Similarly, I see it as like, in the webinar, you tell them what the steps are, but in the course, you walk them through the steps in detail. Well, no, you tell them what the steps are on the sales page of your course because you're going to tell them what the modules are. So that's also not it, right? There's a lot of oversimplified webinar structure and strategy out there that is actually not doing its job, and it's teaching people terrible webinar strategy that doesn't convert very well. Okay, and then the final thing, and I did talk about this in the previous episode, so I won't hark on it for too long, but I open the webinar early. I open the room early. So if the webinar is due to start at 10 a.m., I will open the webinar by 9:55 at the latest. And the reason why I do that is it's ADHD friendly to do that, because as someone who struggles with time blindness and getting distracted, it happens to me a lot. In the past, I've had people even email me after I've sent out the replay of a webinar and saying, hey, I had intended to be there live. And actually, I opened it up 5 minutes beforehand, but then I got distracted. I went to go to the toilet and went and made a cup of tea. And then I decided to put washing on. And by the time I realized I was actually waiting for the webinar to start, it was 20 minutes in and I felt like I'd missed the important part at the start. So I've decided I'll watch the replay. Just wanted to explain why I wasn't there. And I've had that come through enough to know that that is an experience that happens for particularly my neurodivergent folks, but also my busy mums and my busy with life kind of peeps and my not so tech savvy peeps as well, actually. People who didn't realize that if they opened a webinar that was hosted on Zoom on their phone and then they're in the waiting room because it hasn't started yet, and then they go off and they go and look at Facebook or something and they expect the webinar to then pop up in the background. And for most phone operating systems, that doesn't happen. It doesn't alert them. And so they've been scrolling Facebook for 25 minutes, didn't realize, and they thought the webinar, oh, what's happened? This webinar hasn't started. And then when they open the Zoom app again, it opens and like, oh no, it had started. I just thought it would pop up and tell me. Or that kind of thing. So I open early. I open where I can. I'll try and open even 10 minutes early. It's nice to say to people, hey, welcome. Let me know where you're joining in from. Sometimes 10 minutes is a little long. And actually, if you run your webinars through Zoom, Zoom will tell you when someone has joined the room, right? So I will get a little email. I've got the notifications turned on that say, such and such has joined your webinar room. And so usually I'll just watch out for the first person to join the room and then I'll open straight away. And if I haven't had anyone join by 5 to the hour, I'll open it. And then I'm there, ready and waiting, all set up, ready to go. And that also means that I can have my slides ready to go when the webinar time actually comes along. And so I can reward people who've turned up on time by starting pretty much on time. So I generally start the webinar with a welcome at like 1 past. But I'm into the juiciness of the content by like 5 minutes past the hour. So I'm really rewarding people for coming on time. And that means that next time I run a webinar, people show up on time. They don't come in 15 minutes late, expecting that I'm still going to be yapping on about myself. They know I get into the good stuff quickly. So that is the 6th thing that I do that kind of bucks the trends when it comes to webinars. Now, I will have a link to those podcasts in the show notes that relate to webinars. I've got one that I just did recently about sharp rates. I've got another one about structuring a webinar. So I'll put a couple of good ones in the show notes for you if you haven't listened to those before. But also, because it's Tashmas Day 2, I have a really juicy gift for you today. And that is, I am going to do a webinar makeover for someone. We are going to work together on improving the brilliance and the effectiveness of your webinar. And so I'm going to draw one lucky winner. All you need to do is comment on my day 2 post of Tashmas over on my Facebook page with the title of your webinar. Now, this could be a webinar that you're working on but you've never run before, or it could be a webinar that you've run before. I don't mind either way. I will say if you can't choose between the two, let's start with the webinar that you've run before, because we can often use the data from that webinar to inform how we adjust the topic, how we adjust the structure, how we adjust the follow-up email sequence, and all of those sorts of things. So for one lucky winner, you're going to win a webinar makeover, and that consists of a 90-minute session with me where we're going to go through and do some updates and upgrades to your webinar. I'll go through your slides with you and what the structure is and all that kind of stuff. Emails, notifications, reminders, all the things, follow-up emails, what's the upsell, how do you pitch it, that sort of stuff. Promos of the webinar, we get a lot done in 90 minutes. I work at pace. And we will also have a follow-up session after you've run the webinar and your follow-up emails have gone out to review the results and look at how will you refine and improve from there. So that is a 2-session package with me for your webinar makeover, and one lucky person will get it absolutely free simply by coming over to my day 2 post, and I'll link to my Facebook page and everything over with the show notes of today's episode at tashcorbin.com/463. But you'll have to come over to the post on Facebook and let me know what is the title of your webinar that you want to make over. And I will put everyone's name in a draw. We'll draw you out before the end of Tashmas, and we will announce the winner. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the Heart Center Business Podcast. I'll see you tomorrow for day 3 of Tashmas. And until then, I cannot wait to see you shine. Bye for now.